Dobré ráno, máme 9 hodin 1 minuta, možná se nám ještě někdo další připojí, ale já už přesto začnu, abychom my ostatní nemuseli dlouho čekat. Nevím, myslím, že jsme tady všichni se minule také sešli, které vás vidím, že jste připojeni, ale přesto já jsem Eva Chvalkovská a moc vás vítám na dnešním semináři Institutu odpovědného veřejného zadávání, který náš projekt na MPSV založil. A náš seminář, jenom kdyby náhodou někdo nevěděl, se bude věnovat tématu ISO 20400, pokyny pro udržitelné nakupování s aplikací ve veřejném sektoru pro veřejné zadavatele. Náš seminář je plánovaný časově do 12:30, ale uvidíme, jak půjdou debaty, jak to všechno zvládneme. Jsem moc ráda, že i tento druhý díl pro nás připravil Shaun McCarthy, ředitel Action Sustainability. A vypadá to, že dnes budeme v takové menší skupince. Jestli jsem tak dobře počítala, je nás kolem 15 účastníků, takže možná potom to dělení na skupiny, které nás dnes čeká, a ty diskuze, nás nebude tolik skupinek, budeme buď 2 nebo 3, podle toho, jak se kdo ještě přihlásí. Opět budeme mít seminář velmi interaktivní, budeme proto moc rádi, když si zase zapnete kamery, aby se nám v těch skupinách dobře komunikovalo. Ve skupinkách budeme zase moci mluvit česky, ale celkově budeme samozřejmě využívat služby našich 2 milých tlumočnic Jany Markvartové a Lucie Lukavské, které tímto zdravím a děkuji za tu práci, kterou pro nás odvádějí. Z dalších těch technických věcí, které bych měla na začátku zmínit, je, že seminář nahráváme, tak bychom potom ho chtěli zprostředkovat i ostatním, kteří se třeba dnes nemohli připojit. A pokud byste měli nějaké technické problémy, opět na těch mobilech, které jste dostali v e-mailu, jsou k dispozici jak Iva, tak Tereza, případně pro nějaké řešení pomoct vám asistenci. To jsou asi na úvod všechny ty technické detaily, které je potřeba zmínit. Moc se těšíme na vás, protože to, co si dneska vyzkoušíme, nemusíme se toho bát, že nás někdo bude kontrolovat, jestli to máme dobře nebo ne, ale potom věřím, že se nám to dobře bude aplikovat v praxi, využijte to. Možná je to i skvělá příležitost, pokud vás napadnou nějaké dotazy, buď si je zapsat, nebo se rovnou ptát Shauna, protože Shaun je skvělý konzultant a umí perfektně nasměřovat i nás, ačkoliv to britské prostředí je třeba trochu jiné, tak i pro nás ty poznatky jsou často takovým impulzem, jak se na věc dívat trošku jinak. A je skvělé, i když třeba to bude dotaz ne přímo k tomu, co dnes Shaun zmíní, zeptat se ho, sdílet s ním tu svoji praxi a využijte to jedinečné příležitosti, že ho máme na lince. Shaunem, moc děkuji za dnešní přípravu a všichni se moc těšíme zase na seminář, který jste pro nás připravil. Předávám slovo.
Okay, thank you, Ava, and good morning to everybody. Welcome to day 2 of our session. I'm going to share my screen. Right. Okay. So yes, welcome to day 2. The day 1 of our session a couple of weeks ago, we were going through really the sections of the standard. You may remember, so we talked about the fundamentals, the policy and strategy that's necessary to deliver sustainable procurement, and then we went into some detail around what I would call the enablers and what the standard calls organizing the procurement function towards sustainability, and there we looked at the processes, the procedures, how people need to be supported through training, expert sustainability advice, and measuring as well of performance. And we talked also about prioritization, about how we need to look at our categories of supply and our sustainability objectives. So we don't have a one-size-fits-all situation. We actually prioritize those categories of supply that play best into the sustainability objectives that we've set. And we asked you to go away between sessions and have a go at a priority heat map. So I hope some of you managed to get some practice at that between the sessions that we had, because that's where we're going to start this morning. So today is really all about practice. This is all about you trying to put into practice, with a little bit of help from me, what we have learned. So we'll be working in groups today. As Ava said, I think that there's a slightly smaller number of you have come back for the second session, which is probably doesn't speak all that well for my ability as a trainer, but hey, there we go. At least we have, I think, 15 of you. So I would suggest, Ava, maybe if we can divide into 5 groups of 3. Sorry, 3 groups of 5, then you can work together throughout this morning's session on a specific sustainability or procurement activity, and start to think through how you might apply it in real life. So as Ava said, obviously the sessions when you're away in groups will be in Czech, and then we'll get some feedback from each group, which I can get through the interpreters. Okay, got a bit of background noise. If you could go on mute, please, so we can all hear. Okay, so you'll be working in groups today, and what we're going to talk about throughout the morning is the procurement process, which I hope most of you are familiar with. As Ava said, the situation in the UK is a little different to the situation in the Czech Republic. I have worked in your country before, but I'm not totally familiar with the way that you do things. But what I would say is, from my experience of working on developing the ISO 2400 standard with a big multinational committee of people, the procurement process is pretty much the same the world over. The way that we go through planning, the way that we go through market research, pre-qualifying suppliers, tender negotiation, contract award, post-award management, and contract closeout, it is quite a generic process, and that's the process that we're going to go through today, as we think about each stage of that process, how we might apply sustainability, social value, environmental standards, etc., in a different way. So if we think about a procurement checklist, it may look something like this. Yours may be slightly different, but as I say, it's a fairly generic process. So starting off with planning, what is it we actually need? Do we need it at all? You know, that one of the most sustainable thing you will ever buy, and the cheapest thing you will ever buy, is the thing that you don't buy at all. So I think it's a big responsibility for procurement professionals generally, but certainly those procurement professionals that are also thinking about sustainability, to challenge the need. Do we need this? Do we have to buy it? Is there another way of doing things? Risks and impacts. So when we're thinking about a product or service, thinking, you know, before we go out to tender, before we start issuing documents, before we start this flurry of activity that we do in procurement, think about the risks, think about the opportunities, the impacts, thinking about the market that we're buying into. Do we understand that market? Do we understand where the most sustainable options might come from? And then thinking about our strategy. How will we approach this piece of procurement? Then into sourcing. So really defining requirements and how we select our suppliers. And what we'll be talking about today is, when we think about sustainability requirements, there might be things that we can include in a specification. where everybody just bids against a specified requirement. Or there may be elements where we can't be clear in the specification, so we need to include some sustainability issues in our evaluation criteria. And then how do we actually evaluate those criteria, those responses from tenders coming back? Contract award, what do we include in a contract? How do we make sure that what we've asked for in the first place is actually contracted for? Then finally, how do we manage a contract? And this is something I would encourage you to discuss in your groups, because in some organizations, there's one department that places an order or a contract, and then somebody else manages that contract after it's been placed. It's not always the responsibility of a procurement department to manage a contract post-award. But that's a very important element, and we need to understand how we do that and how we manage performance specifically around a contract. Finally, contract review, contract closeout. What happens at the end of a contract? How do we review and learn? If it's an order for goods, then what happens to the thing that we've bought at the end of its life? And what do we need to do at the early stages of procurement to ensure that disposal, for instance, of goods is done in a more sustainable way? So lots to think about throughout the whole course of the workshop and throughout the whole course of the procurement process. So hopefully you would have had a try at producing a heat map like this that you see on your screen in front of you. This is actually from a brewing company, from Molson Coors, a company that brews beer all over the world. So some of the, if you can read the English there, some of the categories that you see might seem a bit strange, but nonetheless, what they did was they looked at their description of their categories of supply. So just looking at some examples here, they buy a lot of bottles, they buy a lot of cans, they buy a lot of refrigeration, they buy a lot of repair equipment, they buy a lot of marketing collateral, so things to sell their beer. And then they buy raw materials to make beer. They buy barley, they buy malt, they buy hops, they buy sugar, etc. And across the top of the heat map, these are their chosen areas of focus for sustainability. So they worry about energy, they worry about air emissions, natural resources, biodiversity, water, waste, pollution, and labour and ethics. So those were the priorities chosen at the time by that company. And then, as you can see, they've coloured up their heat map, red, amber or green, and their focus when they go into a procurement process for any one of those things will be on the red and amber objectives, and less so on the green ones. So if I take the top example there, bottles, beer bottles, they're worried about the energy consumed in making glass, for example, and also energy in the logistics in moving beer bottles around the country or around the world even. They're worried about air emissions. So that specifically, again, is in logistics and the air quality from diesel engines. So that's sulfur dioxide, nitrous oxide emissions from diesel engines. They're worried about water. Glass is a very water intensive product to make. And they're worried about waste. So recycling, recycled content in glass, etc. And you will have seen at the time, because this example was a few years ago, I think one of their competitors, I think it might have been Heineken, if I remember correctly, started reducing the amount of glass. They actually made a big advertising campaign around thinner glass in their bottles, because less glass is less energy intensive. Less glass costs you less as well. And I don't think they put the price of their beer down. So there are opportunities in there that we need to think about. So how can risks be mitigated? How can opportunities be maximized? How many tiers of the supply chain need to be influenced or can be influenced? In my experience working on this around the world, most organizations just look at tier one. They look at the first tier of their supply chain and they don't look at anything else. However, the risks might be in multiple tiers of the supply chain. So if I take two examples, when I was working on the London 2012 Olympics, I did quite a lot of work with Adidas, the sportswear, the German sportswear company. And I went over to visit them in Germany. They were the sportswear sponsors for the London Olympics. And they were saying to me, yeah, we've got, every manufacturing site for every Adidas product. We know exactly what's going on. We've got all the labor standards audited. We've engaged with the workforce. We've really got the ethical standards for employment, really well under control. And I said, yeah, that's very good. And they said, yeah, but we've gone further. We know where every meter of fabric comes from that goes into our Adidas products, and we've got the labor standards under control, and we've got it all audited. Wow, that's fantastic. And they said, yes, but we haven't succeeded yet, because we don't know yet where every fiber comes from that goes into every meter of fabric. And I sort of went, wow, that's why do you want to know about every fiber? Well, interestingly, fibers that go into clothing are usually either cotton or they're a man-made material of some sort, nylon or polyester, whatever. Cotton is potentially a really bad product. A lot of cotton in the world is still picked by forced labor. Cotton is responsible for 25% of the world's pesticides. So there are biodiversity issues in there. There are deforestation issues around cotton plantations. So cotton is potentially really bad stuff. Polyester, nylon, etc., made in chemical plants, where there are very significant health and safety issues, particularly in the developing world. Now, Adidas worry about this because they've got a big company-threatening risk at the top of their risk register, which is primarily about labor standards, employment standards, safety standards in their supply chains. And if something bad is found, as it has been in the past with organizations like Nike, where they're selling footballs for $30 and there are kids sewing them together in Mexico for $1 a week or whatever. If those bad things are found in their supply chains, their market share will drop, their share price will drop, and it's a really existential threat for that business. I was also working a few years ago with the post office in the UK. They buy a lot of fabric as well. They buy uniforms for postal workers, and they were simply looking at tier one. So they asked their tier one supplier to monitor the supply chain for the fabric that goes into the uniforms. And they audited the tier one supplier to make sure that they had it under control. The reason being, although the reputation risk was significant to the post office, it wasn't as serious as Adidas. So when we think about our due diligence in supply chains, we need to think realistically about how far we go. And that's really about the size of the risk or the size of the opportunity that's presented to us. So when I send you off into your groups to think about your products, I'd like you to think about the tiers of the supply chain and how far down you go. So what requirements must be passed through the supply chain? So if you have requirements at the top of the supply chain, so for example, I think I mentioned in the last session, in the UK now, central government purchasers and government agencies are now obliged to apply a 10% evaluation criteria to social value as a minimum. And there's quite a clear definition of social value and what they mean. Well, we need to understand then how that's passed down through the supply chain, because once again, to say there's going to be 10% evaluation criteria at tier 1, for instance, in a construction contract, where typically I would apply a contract to a construction company, and 80% of the revenue to the construction company will go to the supply chain. So we need to understand how those requirements are being passed down the various different tiers. What other stakeholder expectations must be addressed? So this could be local stakeholders, it could be non-government organizations, it could be political leaders. The influence of political leadership in the public sector obviously is very significant. So what politicians are promising and how those things will be delivered, I know there's sometimes a difference, there certainly is in the UK, between what politicians promise and what actually happens. But nonetheless, as public employees, we have a duty to carry out the wishes of those politicians who in turn are carrying out the wishes of the electorate. How much leverage is available to influence? What I mean there is, how much purchasing power do you have? This is quite an important concept to think about. So, for example, I really get very vexed with the IT industry, because if you buy a piece of IT hardware, it comes in an enormous great box with a load of packaging, and then probably another box inside the box. And inside the boxes, there's a tiny little bit of IT kit, and the packaging always, to me, looks to be excessive. But as a purchaser, can I really influence the packaging policies of Hewlett Packard or Toshiba or Apple or whoever? No, I can't. I can only evaluate the packaging strategies of those organizations and pick the one that I think is most appropriate. In other examples, if I'm buying, say, services from a small to medium enterprise, if I might be buying, care services from a local business or cleaning services, I can actually specify quite precisely what I expect. If I want environmentally friendly chemicals to do my cleaning, if I want employees to be employed under certain conditions to do my cleaning, I can demand that. And I can change the market, I can influence the market. So at one extreme, I'm what I would call a market taker. I can just buy the best product or service that's available. I can't influence it. On the other extreme, I'm a market shaper. I can demand from the market what I require. And you don't necessarily need to be a big purchaser to do that. Again, if I take a London 2012 Olympics example as a big example, because the Olympics were such a high profile, and because we were buying a lot of temporary equipment and facilities that were made from PVC, and because PVC is a very health impactful product, we were able to specify requirements for PVC that had never been done in the world before, to eliminate some of the carcinogenic elements of the product. And an Italian company developed a product specifically for the London 2012 Olympics, and they were successful in bidding for that product. So at a big scale, we were able to use the purchasing power of the London Olympics to bring a safer form of PVC to the world. Not everybody can do that, but we can actually influence small and local businesses to specify what we want. Okay, so that's a bit of an introduction of the sort of things that we'll be thinking about, and I'll be taking you through these things and asking you some questions and answering some questions from you, hopefully, as we go into the group work. So if we consider the procurement process, this is the process that that we used in the ISO standard, which is not dissimilar. It came from the Netherlands, but it's not dissimilar to procurement processes that we use around the world. So hopefully you'll recognise it to a degree. So we start any piece of procurement, anything you like, and I'll encourage you when you go into your groups to pick a product. It can be anything that, you know, hopefully some members of the group are familiar with buying. So it can be an item of equipment, it could be a service, it could be a construction project, it can be anything you want. So the sorts of things that you need to consider at the planning stage: total cost of ownership. So if you're buying a product, what does it cost to buy? But what will it cost to own for its life? How long do you expect to have the product? And what will it cost to dispose of it at the end of its life? And can we dispose of it in a sustainable way? If we consider the cost of ownership of a service, what's the cost of the service? But what's the cost of supporting that service? What resources do you need to put in to manage that service going forward? What's the division of scope between you and a supplier? And how do we consider all of those costs? Do we need it at all? Or can we buy less of it? Is it a service, for instance, that could be provided in-house? Do you have to subcontract it? Are there benefits and risks associated with that? Social, economic, and environmental impacts. What is your priority heat map saying to you in terms of the priorities for that product? So, for instance, we looked earlier at beer bottles. You probably don't buy beer bottles as a public authority. At least I hope you don't. But what do you buy, and what are the risks? Early market engagement. What do we know about the market for this product, and what do we need to know? Can we research into what best practice is? You will often find that some of your suppliers can offer you really sustainable options if only you know about them and if only you ask for them. Engaging with stakeholders. So who needs to give you advice? Who might have an opinion around this product? So for example, if you're buying a very energy intensive product with a lot of CO2 emissions, then do you need some advice from your environment department? If you're buying a service with that employs a lot of low wage workers, for instance, then do you need some advice from your human resources people about labour standards? Do the trade unions need to be involved at some point in understanding what those standards should be? Understanding how the supply chain perceives you. So what can you do to be an attractive purchaser? Bearing in mind, it's always, I've worked in both in sales and procurement in my career, and it's very easy as a procurer to assume because you're the one paying the bills that you're judging your suppliers and they're not judging you. Believe me, they do. Suppliers will prioritize their customers and how much focus they put into that customer relationship, depending on how attractive that customer is. And sustainability can be one of those things that attracts suppliers into your supply chain. Horizon scanning. What is it you're going to be looking for in the future? So if you're buying goods, for instance, construction, what are the trends around things like energy performance of buildings that you might want to consider? What are the issues that might be coming forward? I mean, for example, EU legislation. What EU legislation is in the planning phase at the moment? So the sort of things to think about: modern slavery, due diligence in supply chains. There are some local examples. EU has a Modern Slavery Act. France has a Due Diligence in Supply Chain Act. A lot of those are now kind of being interpreted into EU legislation. So that might be something in a year or two that you'll need to worry about. So what is it we can anticipate going forwards? Competition amongst supply chains. Actually making sure that you're not setting the bar so high, requirements for sustainability, that it limits competition. If there's only a small number of suppliers that can comply with your requirements, then the price will go up. And clearly we don't want that. We have to set realistic expectations. And then transparency. Is transparency required and possible? Do you want your suppliers to identify their locations, their manufacturing locations, for example? That could be a very key thing. In some cases, that's not possible due to security requirements or whatever it might be. So things to think about at the planning stage. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to ask Ava and the team to send you off into your groups. What I would like you to do is to discuss your priority heat maps. If those of you that have had a try of doing a heat map offline, between you, I'd like you to pick a product or service, one thing that you buy, that you work on as a group throughout the course of today's session. Ideally, it's something that at least one of you in the group has some familiarity with. It's something that you understand as a product. And then I think what I would like you to do is to start to think about your procurement planning. So you're going to buy a product or service or a building. It can be anything that you're reasonably familiar with. If you're planning a piece of procurement and you're incorporating sustainability into that procurement, what is it you need to think about? What are the main sustainability impacts that you need to consider? What do you need to include in your plan? So what procurement route might you take? What do you need to do before you start your procurement to understand the sustainability impacts and to understand the market that you're buying into? So don't worry too much at this stage about pre-qualification, tender, all of those things. We'll do that later. If I can ask you to spend, let's say, 15 minutes on selecting your product, selecting your sustainability impacts related to that product, and starting to think about what a procurement plan might look like to address those sustainability impacts.
I'm sorry, Shaun, if I may interrupt you.
Yep.
I think we lost the Czech channel.
I will translate it.
Okay, thank you.
Or recap it. Takže já jsem zaznamenala, že byl nějaký problém s tlumočením, ale přesto já bych teda to zkusila zrekapitulovat v češtině. Snažila jsem se zapsat to zadání, tak snad doufám, že si všichni porozumíme. To znamená, teď nás čeká rozdělení do skupin po zhruba těch 5 lidech a měli bychom debatovat vlastně to, jak jsme zpracovali ten náš domácí úkol heatmap. To znamená, že každý by měl říct, nad čím se zamyslel, co zpracovával a ta skupina si vybere jeden produkt nebo službu, který potom na něm bude pracovat v průběhu dnešního celého dne. A to znamená nějaký produkt nebo službu, který aspoň jeden z té skupiny nějakým způsobem dobře zná, aby se o tom dobře diskutovalo, aby to nebylo něco neznámého pro vás ostatní. A u tohoto produktu v tomto cvičení se zaměříme na tu fázi plánování, to znamená na tu první, kterou ukazoval vlastně v té prezentaci a budeme se zamýšlet nad tím dopadem na udržitelnost, to znamená hodně to souvisí i s tím právě s tou heatmap a na jaké dopady v rámci udržitelnosti se musí myslet. Měl tam ty fáze zmapovat vůbec ty potřeby.
Yes, I can hear you.
Už Shaun slyší.
But I'm not getting the translation.
Aha, asi tak nevím, doufám, že se to brzy vyřeší. Zmapovat, jaká jsou ta rizika a zmapovat ty příležitosti, které se týkají právě dopadu udržitelnosti v rámci tohoto produktu nebo služby. Jaký je trh, jak můžeme zaangažovat trh nebo případně další stakeholdery, ty zainteresované strany, ať už jsou to uživatelé nebo někdo v organizaci, organizátor, kdo s tím má co společného a jakou strategii teda před tím samotným zadáváním zakázky k tomu, jak k tomu přistoupíte. Takže to by mělo být během teď rozdělení do skupin 15 minut, pak nás to, buď se musíte sami připojit do toho hlavního streamu, anebo potom ještě po další jako minutě nás to automaticky zase propojí. Skupinky máme připravené, takže já myslím, že můžu vydat pokyn k rozdělení.
Welcome back, everybody. So yes, what I'd like to do is just go around the groups one at a time. Firstly, I'd like to understand if I gave you enough time or too much time to have a discussion. We've chosen 15 minutes, but it can be a little more or a little less, depending on how much time you think you need. Then I would like to understand what product you've chosen and why, and what sustainability impacts you think you want to apply to your procurement. And then broadly, what you think you should include in your procurement plan. Obviously, if there are any questions that come out of the group, I'd be very happy to take those and to have a discussion. So if one group would like to volunteer to feedback, if not, I will ask Ava to choose a group.
Tak já možná začnu s tím vybráním, protože já tady vidím to rozdělení do těch skupinek, ať to máme jednodušší. Byli jsme 3 skupinky a v první, co já mám jako první, byl určitě Jakub Váňa, Marcela Kukijová, pan Vápeník, paní Konvalinová a paní Millerová Prášková. Tak tuhle skupinu vyzývám, jestli to bylo takto rozděleno, ať se někdo ozve.
Asi můžu za naší skupinu. Musím říct, že bychom asi uvítali ještě trošku času a nevím, jestli to úplně byla 4 hodina, kterou jsme dostali. Měli jsme pocit, že tam bylo 10 minut na odpočtu jenom, takže i ta 4 hodina by byla fajn. Jinak my jsme se bavili primárně o stavebních pracech, protože to je okruh zakázek, kterému se nejvíc věnujeme v naší práci a z toho jsme si z hlediska udržitelnosti vybrali téma minimalizace dopadů na životní prostředí. Bavili jsme se primárně o rekonstrukcích, kde vidíme celou řadu možností a témat, ať už je to nějaká vlastně minimalizace odpadů nebo jejich využití nějakých odpadů z stavebních, z těch rekonstrukcí, z těch demolic, demontáží, využívání druhotných surovin při realizaci staveb, minimalizace dopadů těch staveb na okolí, ať už v průběhu jejich provádění, čili minimalizace nějakého hluku, prašnosti, dopravních omezení a podobně, tak potom samozřejmě i těch hotových staveb, tak by byly vlastně šetrné k životnímu prostředí, ke svému okolí a tak podobně. Takže tohle my jsme tak nějak začali probírat a v podstatě jsme skončili tak někde uprostřed, protože na takovou diskuzi asi by toho času bylo potřeba víc.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I must admit, I thought the 15 minutes went a bit quickly as well, so maybe it was only 10. So what we'll do is we'll give you a little bit of extra time in the next session just to catch up. So that's fine. So the product you've chosen is refurbishment of buildings. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay, so okay, I'm getting lots of English now. Okay, yeah, interesting product to choose. You've focused obviously specifically on the environmental impacts, which I can see. So you've looked at the energy efficiency of the building, presumably before and after the refurbishment. We've talked about obviously waste, things like dust control. I think you talked about logistics and transport. So we've got the carbon efficiency of the building. We've got the energy impacts of the refurbishment activity, the work that's going on in the construction, and then obviously during the operation, during the actual construction work itself, then it's waste. If you're taking content out of a building, then what do you do with it? Where does it go, etc. I don't think you can ignore the social impacts. You focused hard on environment, and I do recognize that you were a little bit short of time, so you may not have had time to discuss everything. So we'll give a bit of extra time for the next session so you can all catch up. I think there could be issues in there socially, particularly around community and community engagement. So if you're refurbishing a building where people live, for example, then the impacts on the community can be quite significant. Employment and skills. So thinking about, you know, the sort of social impact. Is there some good that you can do from employing local businesses or local people, and maybe offering them training opportunities? There might be, I don't know the Czech Republic as well as maybe I should, but I know there are issues around ethnic minorities, particularly Roma people. So like in Australia, we'd be dealing with indigenous people and disadvantaged communities. Are there opportunities potentially through the refurbishment to bring them into the employment side of things? I don't know if you have, do you have standards for building efficiency? So in the UK, we have BREEAM. There are LEED standards for buildings in the United States, which are used quite internationally. There's a standard in Asia Pacific region called, I can't remember what it's called now, but there are various energy standards for buildings. Is that something that you apply in your country?
Já za nás můžu říct, že víme o těch mezinárodních standardech. Z českých tady máme, tuším, SB Tool, který se tak nějak začíná používat, který je v podstatě takovou českou obdobou tady těch mezinárodních standardů. My jsme zatím přímo ten standard jako celek neaplikovali, spíš jsme si z toho třeba vybírali některá kritéria, která jsme potom zahrnovali do těch těch zakázek.
Okay, so that's interesting as you go into the next stage, because I'd have to say I'm not a great fan of these standards. They don't give you everything, but it is a way of creating what I would call a level playing field. So you can apply a standard, and then everybody that tenders, that they comply with the standard. It becomes part of the specification. But I would recommend as well setting specific targets in addition to the standard if you decide to apply a standard. So something to think about in the next stage. Are you going to apply a standard? Might you set targets for things like waste diverted from landfill, energy efficiency of equipment, etc., etc. So you've chosen a good subject because there's lots to think about in buildings. And we can take that forward into the next session. So thank you for that, and apologies if the session was a little short. What we'll do, if we can have 20 minutes for the next session so you can catch up and then do the next exercise. Okay, can we have the next group, please?
Další skupina byla se mnou, tak já bych vyzvala někoho z naší skupiny, aby představil naši diskuzi. Přihlásí se někdo dobrovolně? Nebo mám vyzvat třeba dámy z Brna, které... Dito, prosím.
Somebody speak to me.
Tak dobrý den, my teda znovu z Jihomoravského kraje, který už tady jednou mluvil. Naše skupinka si shodou okolností vybrala také stavební práce, takže jsme diskutovali ty možnosti té udržitelnosti tady v této oblasti, jelikož většina z nás v podstatě ten největší objem investic investuje do těch stavebních prací. A v podstatě už bychom se opakovali, protože ta témata jsme rozebírali dost obdobná jako skupinka číslo 1. Možná bych ještě doplnila právě to, co říkal Shaun. Diskutovali jsme i možnosti těch sociálních aspektů, jak z hlediska podpory malých a středních podniků, tak z hlediska podpory vzdělávání a zaměstnanosti osob znevýhodněných na trhu práce. Tak to bych jenom doplnila k těm environmentálním tématům, že jsme řešili i tady.
Okay, thank you. So yeah, I do hope Group 3 isn't doing construction as well. But okay. No, thank you for that. I think it is important, as I said earlier, to consider the social aspects as well as environmental. So in the next session, it will be helpful to start to list those in a little bit more detail, and let's think about what standards we can set and how we can take that forward through the procurement process. Okay, thank you. So if we can move then to the third group.
A ve třetí skupině byl Zdeněk Cvejn, Martin Rajman, Lukáš Křesálek, paní Eva Gregorová, takže vyzývám některého ze zástupců, nevím, jestli ještě někdo další.
Tak já si vemu slovo. My jsme, or I will start in English. We discussed about the category to choose, and after some discussion we have chosen a category of computer hardware, let's say PCs, notebooks, computer screens, because this is a category which everybody procures, and we hadn't had enough time. But what we managed to do is to discuss the sustainability impacts, and we identified especially the environmental topic, then circular economy, and also labor, health, safety, and also business ethics. And we had some discussion. What is in a red color? For me, it's environment. My colleague from, I guess, from Charles University identified a circular economy as the primary topic. And that's all we managed in the short time.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, we will give you a little more time in the next session. I'm really relieved to hear that you didn't choose construction, so thank you for that. Yeah, very different products, and you know, I think you've hit a lot of the sustainability impacts, and hopefully in the next session we can expand on those a little bit. So things to think about in IT, you're absolutely right. Circular economy. You know, what happens to equipment at the end of its life. In the example I quoted earlier, of course, you're dealing with the mega corporations, so your ability to influence them is relatively small. So it's all about finding out and understanding what their policies are in a way that you choose the right options, rather than in a construction sense, as we were talking earlier. When we have local contractors, by way of example, we can influence. Where we have designers, design is very important in construction. So if you're refurbishing a building, you can ask the designer to design it to a certain level of energy efficiency, and you can justify that by looking at the whole life cost of a building. In IT, it's very much, you're very much selecting standard products, but something to think about in your planning, and this is for any type of product that is ultimately disposable. What is the life, you know, of a laptop or a piece of equipment that you're buying? How long do you expect to have it before you replace it for another piece of equipment? And are there different options for procurement? So, for instance, can you lease rather than buy IT equipment? Can you have a take-back arrangement at the end of life? Are you buying directly from a manufacturer, or are you buying from a reseller that can give you lots of different options? Logistics, delivery, maintenance and support. And as you quite rightly say, circular economy is so important. You know, a piece of kit can be reused, recycled at the end of its life, but if you don't specify that at the beginning, then that's something quite difficult to do. So yeah, thank you for that. That's an interesting product. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to share my screen again and just do a couple of slides before we move on to the next bit. So innovation is something to consider as we move into the next phase. So this is, you know, the examples that you're using, particularly the construction examples. How can we set challenging sustainability objectives that encourage innovation? So this is what I would call outcome specification. So, for example, you could apply, you know, you said there's a local standard for refurbishment of buildings, or you can apply an international standard. So you say you want a certain level of LEED certification or BREEAM certification that will give a challenge to the designers, or you can specify an amount of energy consumption per square meter of floor space in a building, and if you provide a very challenging specification, then that drives your designers and your construction contractors towards innovation. understanding what innovative products there are in the IT world. So again, what products are coming that you might be able to buy that maybe you don't know about today. So again, that's where getting some good advice is really helpful from the experts. Supply chain resilience. So thinking about, again, if you think about buildings in particular, climate change is going to happen. You know, it's just a question of how much. So we are going to see probably more extreme weather events, warmer and wetter weather, flood risk might come into thinking about your design for your building. Digital solutions, so how might we bring in digital technology in both products? Increasing the use of technology, so can we in construction, what digital techniques, building information modeling, for example, can be used and can be brought into the design requirement and into the design process. So, you know, what might we invest in thinking about getting some expertise here? So again, an example, not in IT hardware, but in software. I run a small business in the UK. You know, we employ about 30 people. We're not big, but we run something called the Supply Chain Sustainability School in the UK. And we were investing massively for my business in a new web platform. And what we did was we narrowed down to 2 suppliers. We went through a process of pre-qualification. We came down to 2 suppliers, and we paid both of those suppliers to start to work up a solution for us. So we paid an amount of money to them to do a proper piece of work for us to design the solution rather than completely relying on competitive tender. The reason we did that, of course, is because we were paying for the design, so then the intellectual property would belong to us. So the supplier that we've chosen, we'd have a good rich vein of information there. And also it encouraged the supplier to really think through our requirement rather than doing the minimum to give us a solution until and then once we've raised the contract, we discover there's all sorts of things that we hadn't thought of or hadn't included, and that led to a very successful implementation. So there's investment up front in time and money. So for example, if I look at both examples in the planning phase, you know, I mentioned earlier energy performance, you know, so kilowatt hours per square meter of floor space. Well, that's where some advice is needed. I don't know what the right benchmark is for one of your buildings in kilowatt hours per square meter of floor space. And some of you on the call may know, but you probably don't. So you need to get some advice. That could come from internal experts. It could come from an independent design consultant, by way of example. So there could be investment at the very early stages of procurement to get the final outcomes. Again, research into the IT hardware market to understand which of the suppliers out there have good circular economy credentials, by way of example. So, you know, in my Hewlett-Packard printer that I have at home, Hewlett-Packard sent me an envelope that I can put my used ink cartridges in, and once I've got, you know, 6 or 8 ink cartridges and the envelope is full, I put it in the post and it goes somewhere to be recycled. That's quite a significant benefit. That's not something that maybe every supplier offers. So really thinking through at the early stage and doing your market research is very, very important to you. This slide is a diagram from the standard, and it tries to describe the sort of levels of thinking that you can apply to your procurement depending on what you're procuring. So obviously at the lowest level, there's price. Total cost of ownership we've spoken about, and in both examples that you have there, you can think about the cost of a building, the cost of maintaining that building, the cost of the energy in that building. In IT, obviously, you've already hit on circular economy, what happens to the piece of IT equipment at the end of its life, what consumables might I have, not so much in laptops and computers, but certainly in things like printers. You know, that there are consumable elements and that the costs can be brought in there. And what about disposal at the end of life? Can I send the equipment back? Do I need to pay to have it disposed of in a sustainable way? When I think about life cycle costs, then I'm bringing in some of the monetizable impacts around, particularly some of the social impacts. So if I do employ a number of apprentices, if I employ previously unemployed people, maybe ex-offenders, I'm actually taking those people out of the social system, and there is a benefit there to government, to the exchequer, in not having to support somebody maybe that's unemployed or disabled, or whatever. So bringing people into employment. And then finally, the non-monetizable benefits. So this is thinking about the sort of macroeconomic impacts on society. So for example, if you refurbish a building in a way that the exterior of the building, for instance, is well lit and secure, and there's maybe some social space there, and as a result of that, people feel safer from say fear of crime, that's a non-monetizable social benefit that you can do through social evaluations and questionnaires and thinking about some of those wider impacts. You probably won't go to the end of that diagram straight away, but you might like to think about how far you do want to go. Okay, so I'm going to move us on now to the next stage of the procurement process, but recognizing that you might need to catch up a little on the previous stage because we didn't give you quite enough time. So stating the social, economic and environmental requirements. So you will have thought through in a bit more detail, taken a bit more time to think through the impacts that you're trying to address and what they might mean. The golden thread through to your policy and strategy. So getting those requirements really very clearly identified. Make sure they can be delivered. So if you set objectives that are far too challenging, then you shrink your competition. Scope to leverage, we've spoken, and I like the fact that we've got at one end where your scope to influence IT suppliers is probably zero. I was going to say small, but it's not small. So you're about understanding what's available, whereas your scope to influence building refurbishments is very wide. So, you know, we can think about that. Think about things that bidders can include in their pricing schedules, by way of example, things that can be measured, things that can be reported. Are we really addressing the big issues that we think our governments need us to address? And for example, our minimum levels of performance required. So it might be, as we said earlier, you might want to apply a standard for your buildings. You might want to apply something like Energy Star for IT equipment, which is quite a common standard. There might be other standards that you might want to research and to understand in a better way. There's tons of product labels out there for different things. What I would say is at this early stage of procurement, if you are going to use a product standard, do spend some time researching what it actually means. Because all of the standards here that we have in front of us and the labels that we have aren't necessarily everything they appear to be. Some are very clearly independently verified. Some include some impacts and not other impacts. So if I take that there's fair trade there, for example, which is a very good, well-established standard. You know, a number of food products can be bought as fair trade, and you can be pretty sure that down through the supply chain, the growers of the products are getting a fair price for their products. But fair trade doesn't necessarily cover the environmental impacts. On the other hand, if I look at another food standard, Rainforest Alliance, there's a lot of environmental impacts that are covered there, but not necessarily a fair price. So I think it's doing some research rather than just kind of randomly picking a standard and thinking, yeah, that'll be okay. I think it's really important to understand what's going on behind some of those labels. Okay, so what I'd like you to do now is to move on into your groups. If we can allow 20 minutes, then please for the groups, so that gives you plenty of time to catch up on the last bit of your discussion, and start to think about now your specification. So, what is it you will specify in your procurement in order to have that level playing field? So everybody that bids is bidding on the same basis. I will take you on in the next session to those criteria that you might want to evaluate as part of a balanced scorecard. So we're looking at both, but in many cases, if you write something into a specification, it makes it easier for you, because either the supplier complies or they don't. So it's quite a binary selection, and then they will price for complying with that specification, and then you've got a normal sort of comparison of costs that you would expect to see. It makes life easier in the EU procurement rules as well, and it makes life simpler for you, but not everything can be written into a specification. So I hope that's clear. Ava, I don't know if we need to clarify any more or just send everybody into their groups.
Já myslím, že to bylo jasné, jenom rychlá rekapitulace. Teď se máme zamyslet nad tím, co natvrdo napsat do specifikace předmětu plnění a jak bychom to tedy kontrolovali nebo měřili. A za 20 minut se opět zase sejdeme zpátky a popovídáme si o tom. Můžeme se, myslím, tímto rozdělit.
Okay, so hopefully we have everybody back in the main room. I hope that allowed you enough time to catch up on the conversation from the first session and then start to think about specification. So if we can have some feedback from the groups, please, the first group or any group that would like to volunteer.
Tak první skupina byla, hlásí se už někdo, nebo?
Tak já můžu asi zase navázat. Díky teď za ten čas navíc, bylo to určitě lepší, my jsme se teda v podstatě bavili o jedné konkrétní zakázce, kterou teď Jihomoravský kraj zadává a kde jsme se snažili vlastně promítnout nebo bavili jsme se o tom, jakým způsobem jsme promítli naše priority, naše cíle, které máme stavené v krajské strategii odpovědného zadávání do té konkrétní zakázky. S tím, že jak jsem říkal předtím, hodně jsme se zaměřovali na dopady na životní prostředí, čili využívání nějaké zpracování odpadů, využívání druhotných surovin a minimalizaci dopadů na okolí. Tyhle ty věci z těch jsme v podstatě udělali hodnotící kritéria v rámci té zakázky, tak aby nám dodavatelé mohli nabídnout to co umějí v této oblasti, to, na co jsou zvyklí, s čím pracují a tak podobně. Čili tady jsme předepsali jenom v obecné rovině nějaké minimální požadavky, vymezili jsme ty naše priority a popsali jsme, čeho bychom rádi dosáhli, co je nějaký takový ten top cíl, prostě, který bude nejlépe hodnocený. Potom jsme se zabývali problematikou poddodavatelů a férových vztahů v dodavatelském řetězci, což je taky taková obecná priorita Jihomoravského kraje a tu v podstatě řešíme v rámci minimálních požadavků té zakázky. Tam jsou požadavky na třeba včasné platby poddodavatelům a ty férové vztahy jsou částí obchodních podmínek těch našich veřejných zakázek, čili tam o tom není žádná diskuze, tam tak prostě musí být. A posledním tím okruhem, kterým jsme se zabývali, tak byla zaměstnanost, podpora vzdělávání a podobně. Tady tím, že tahleta zakázka je trošku specifická v tom, že bude probíhat vlastně za plného provozu našeho úřadu a přímo na tom úřadě, tak my cílíme celou řadu těch prací na třeba víkendy nebo dobu někdy po večerech, po pracovní době a tak podobně, aby nebylo omezených od toho úřadu. Takže s ohledem tady na to jsme v téhleté zakázce ustoupili od nějakých požadavků na studentské praxe a podobně, protože tady to nevidíme úplně jako vhodné. A v podstatě jenom chceme sledovat, jak ten dodavatel se tím bude nebo nebude zabývat, když to po něm není striktně vyžadováno, když je to v podstatě na jeho nějakém uvážení. A to též platí i o podpoře zaměstnanosti osob se stíženým přístupem na trh práce, kde jsme nakonec po nějaké diskuzi taky žádné konkrétní požadavky nestanovili, ale v rámci reportu, který nám dodavatel v průběhu realizace zakázky bude předkládat, tak vlastně chceme sledovat i tady to, aby jsme měli i tu informaci, jak ten trh vlastně běžně funguje, i když to po něm striktně nevyžadujeme, nebo není to v těch podmínkách té zakázky. Takže to je asi za mě teď všechno.
Brilliant, thank you. So can we get the second group then that was doing construction, and then we'll cover all the construction issues in one go.
To je naše skupina a já možná zkusila bych poprosit paní Radku Škubalovou z Příbramy, jestli by nám zrekapitulovala, o čem jsme se bavili, má taky zkušenosti s stavebními pracemi. Paní Radko Škubalová, jste tam?
Dobrý den, já se omlouvám, vás nebylo slyšet ten začátek té vaší věty a slyšeli jsme jenom stavebními pracemi. Takže
jestli byste mohla zrekapitulovat to, o čem my jsme se bavili, do co by bylo vhodné, do specifikace, s čím třeba máte vyzkušenost. Vlastně.
My jsme v naší skupině se hodně bavili o tom poddodavatelském řetězci, jednak o úskalích těch plateb poddodavatelům, pokud je to striktně stanoveno smlouvou, kdy kolegyně vlastně interpretovala svoji zkušenost, že se jim tento systém zcela úplně asi neosvědčil a zvažují velmi, jestli ho budou používat a za jakých podmínek. Potom jsme řešili požadavky na případné ISO normy, které vlastně stanovují určité standardy. Zejména třeba my máme konkrétně zkušenost, že jsme měli stavební zakázku, která se realizovala v blízkosti chráněné krajinné oblasti. Takže jsme se dali do zadávacích podmínku, že dodavatel musí mít příslušnou ISO normu na řízení ochrany životního prostředí. A ač teda ne všichni měli obdobně pozitivní zkušenost, tak my jsme dostali nadstandardní množství nabídek a vlastně jsme si zjistili už v rámci nějaké přípravy té zakázky, že ten trh je na některé z těchto požadavků připraven. A řešili jsme ještě problematiku předběžných tržních konzultací, kdy vlastně zadavatel si může zjistit ty možnosti těch dodavatelů, nicméně Momentálně jsme dospěli i do takového jakoby mrtvého bodu, že tím legislativním posunem, který byl teď na začátku roku u nás, tak se setkáváme s tím, že firmy nejsou příliš ochotné na požadavek předběžných tržních konzultací vždycky reagovat. Myslíme si, že to může být dáno právě tím, že momentálně se tou cestou vydává hodně zadavatelů a ty firmy jsou jakoby přehlcené těmi požadavky a ten přínos pro ně v rámci těch předběžných tržních konzultací není až takový. Pak jsme řešili ještě samozřejmě také zaměstnávání těch osob znevýhodněných na trhu práce, kde vlastně závěr byl takový, že to může být regionálně vnímáno, protože v některých regionech je to problém, v některých to problém není. To by asi bylo za naši skupinu všechno. Děkuji.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, a few really interesting points in there. I think between you know, you're covering most of the issues, and clearly this is a classroom exercise. You can't do everything in 20 minutes, but I think you're starting to get the idea of the sort of standards that you can apply. Yes, there might obviously need to be some research in terms of, if you were to say, look at waste diverted from landfill, then you need to understand what a good performance looks like. And that early market engagement might give you some feedback on that. Really good point about ISO standards, and one to consider. So if you look at a standard like ISO 14001, for example, it's very convenient just to say, you know, I want my main contractors to be certified to ISO 14001. You send me the certificate, you've either got it or you haven't. So that makes it really easy for the buyer. But as the second group pointed out, not everybody has that. They may have very good environmental practices, but they haven't necessarily got the certificate. Sometimes because it costs money to do that. You have to pay to have the audit done and to have the certificate. So the other approach would be to say, we want you to have an environmental management system, by way of example, that is commensurate with your size and type of business. And you ask the supplier in their tender, so you move it from a specification to say you must have ISO 14001 to you must have an environmental management system. But then that places a burden on the evaluator, because the company then will submit their environmental management system or a summary of it. And then you need to have somebody in your team that will review that to say, is that an acceptable system or not? I prefer the second way, because then at least you're providing an opportunity for smaller businesses, for example. You're allowing entry to more businesses into your supply chain, and that gives you greater competition. So I thought it was really interesting to hear that, you know, some suppliers are actually reluctant to commit to some of these things. And, you know, you need to find ways of addressing the market in a way that they'll be willing to tender to you, because clearly if you're in a single tender situation or a no tender situation, that's really not desirable for you. So it's arriving at the right levels. Payment, yeah, I'm glad you both mentioned payment. It is a huge issue in construction, because most construction supply chains are very deep and very wide. There are many subcontractors, and construction businesses sometimes don't treat their subcontractors as well as we would like. So having some reporting up and down the line around payment is a very good idea. Okay, so thank you for that. I think we're starting to get around the idea of what we can include in a specification and what we can evaluate in a tender. So that's fantastic. Thank you. Okay, so can we have the third group, please? And let's hear about IT.
Tak já se mu zase slovo, tentokrát v češtině. Tak my jsme vycházeli z toho, že ten trh je globální, že ty výrobci jsou jedni z největších firm na světě a že my jsme vlastně relativně malí. Takže ty jednotlivé oblasti jsme pojali asi následovně. Hodně jsme diskutovali o recyklaci, tam já jsem i tohle téma diskutoval i s dodavateli. Za A u nás v České republice existuje povinnost zpětného odběru toho zařízení a jelikož to zařízení obsahuje drahé kovy, tak je i relativně zájem a dokonce firmy i platí za to, když jim prodáte vyřazené počítače. Takže nám přišlo, že to nemusíme až tak úplně řešit. Nicméně přišlo nám zajímavý zvážit variantu operativního leasingu, že bychom ten problém vlastně tak trošku přehodili na dodavatele s tím, že nevíme, jestli ten trh u nás je dostatečně rozvinutý. Někdy si někdo něco takového nabízel, ale už je to asi 7-8 let. U našich standardních dodavatelů si nejsem jist, jestli takovou službu nabízejí, takže bychom museli udělat předběžné tržní konzultace. Pak jsme řešili problematiku obalů. Tam já vím, že jeden náš dodavatel má ISO 14001, tak jsem se ho na to ptal a on mi říkal, že nikdy žádný jejich zákazník to nevyužil. Že prostě oni to nabízejí, ale nikdy to nikdo nevyužil. U nás konkrétně máme poměrně dobře vyvinutý odpadový hospodářství, protože vyrábíme dekorace pro natáčení pořadů, takže my zrovna obaly umíme poměrně slušně rozstřídit a nakládat s nimi tak, jak se má. Takže třeba u nás ani tohle téma jsme moc neřešili. Řešili jsme energetickou účinnost, zařízení se vlastně připojuje k elektrické síti. Tam bychom to řešili tak, že bychom vyžadovali, aby každý ten výrobek měl certifikaci Energy Star, což je program americké agentury pro životní prostředí. Je to naprostý standard u hardwareu. Splňuje to opravdu veliké množství zařízení, vůbec se nemusíme bát nějaké diskriminace. Dále bychom asi vyžadovali certifikaci TCO Certified, což je opět, dá se říct, dneska už globální standard, pokrývající požadavky životního prostředí, ergonomie, dokonce i nějaké sociální otázky. Je to standard, není problém to asi vyžadovat. Navíc jak Energy Star, tak TCO Certified mají webové stránky, kde si můžete zadat ty výrobky, na které cílíte a ověřit si, jestli ty požadavky splňují. Tak pak jsme měli oblast nějakých lidských práv a práv zaměstnanců, kterou vnímáme jako problematickou. Tam bychom vyžadovali, aby náš dodavatel doložil, že výrobce zařízení má nějaký kodex, který pokrývá v rámci celého výrobního řetězce ty klíčové otázky lidských práv a práv zaměstnanců typu zákaz práce dětí, zákaz diskriminace, zákaz nucené práce, svoboda shromažďování a sdružování v odborech a tak dále. S tím, že by nám to doložil buď odkazem na nějaké webové stránky toho výrobce, nebo případně čestným prohlášením, nicméně připodepsaným tím výrobcem. Nevěřím čestnému prohlášení jenom dodavatele, chtěl bych, aby nám to prohlásil importér do České republiky, ten oficiální zástupce toho výrobce. to je asi vše. V podstatě se dá říct, že tím, že jsou to globální výrobci, v Čechách mají jenom přeprodejce, tak nemáme moc požadavky na dodavatele, spíše máme požadavky na výrobky a požadavky na výrobce.
Brilliant, thank you. A lot of issues covered off there, and I think your issue around human rights is really important, and you're starting to look at now beyond tier 1 down into the sub-suppliers, because clearly there's a lot of controversy in the IT industry about component manufacture in the developing world, etc. I do remember again another story from the London Olympics. Acer were the computer sponsor for the Olympics, so effectively what they were doing was supplying all the computers for free in return for brand recognition as a sponsor. They changed they didn't make anything. They just designed computers, and everything is made by a supply chain. So it's 100% outsourced model. And they changed every supplier of every component every 6 months.
Oh.
How you can trace the human rights issues in a supply chain like that, I have no idea. And it was interesting to understand that. And the Olympics, they used Acer. It was a commercial decision, but it certainly wasn't something I would recommend, because it's impossible to trace the supply chain when you have that sort of dynamism. And obviously it's all done to drive the price down. So each component has 6 months to supply as cheaply as possible, and then they move on to a cheaper manufacturer and a cheaper manufacturer and a cheaper manufacturer. So yeah, very important that you understand those issues. Talked about recycling. There are also some schemes around reuse. So for instance, donating hardware to schools, or in particular at the moment during the COVID crisis to households that may be homeschooling and don't have access to a computer. So there are some kind of ethical benefits that we can think about there. Energy Star is a good standard, and something that, as you say, can be applied universally. And most manufacturers will have Energy Star products, and then you've got that level playing field, thinking about the energy conservation and energy requirements for the products. Okay, so we might need to speed up a little bit, because we're taking quite a bit of time, but no apologies for that, because the planning side of things is really important. Also, I'm very conscious that I've been working you quite hard this morning and haven't given you a break. So maybe if we can take a 10-minute break, so you get a chance to have a stretch and make a drink or whatever. And if we can come back in 10 minutes time, so that's if we say 11:10 your time, and then we'll reconvene. Okay, hello everybody, and welcome back. I hope we've got you all back from your break, and you come back suitably refreshed. I'm going to share my screen again. Okay, so hopefully you can see my screen. So we've looked at the product that you've chosen. We've looked at the sustainability impacts that are important to those products that you've chosen. We've started to think about what we can include in a specification. What I'd like you to think about now is performance targets. And we talked in the last session about SMART, specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and timely. So in the next exercise, we're going to think about what SMART targets you might apply to your contracts. And just to give you some examples of targets that might be SMART or not SMART, there's a series of different statements on the screen here. And if I start to sort those into which targets may be smart and which targets might not be smart, in the green text, I've got targets like work to be complete and signed off by the site manager within 12 weeks to contract award. That's specific, it's time bound, it's achievable. It's, you know, when you say specific, the site manager must sign it off, and there's a specific time scale available to do that. 98% of product delivered with no defects or returns. So that would be a product supply. Again, it's very specific. It's about a percentage. Defects may be defined in a little bit more detail. Returns, obviously, we've only sent an absolute maximum of 2% of the products back. Then there's a social one. 80% of the person hours worked on site each month are by people who permanently reside in a certain area. So that might be in your local area. You want to see a high percentage, for instance, of local employees to support the economy. Or a safety one, 0 lost time injuries throughout the duration of the contract. Things that aren't smart: demonstrate exceptional value for money. What does that mean? Can mean absolutely anything. All work to be completed to a satisfactory standard. What does satisfactory mean? And finally, 80% of the workforce to be local. Well, that's quite good, but what does local mean? How do you define local? And, you know, do you have issues with, for instance, migrant labor, as I know you do have in some cases in the Czech Republic, people who might reside in the local community, but they're not necessarily permanently resident in that community. So paying some attention to being really finely honed in terms of the targets that you set for your contracts. So what I'd like you to do in the next group, and if 20 minutes is a good time for you, then I'm happy to allow 20 minutes for you to give this some thought. So if you pick some of the sustainability impacts that you've chosen, not all of them, because you both come up with, all groups have come up with quite a big agenda of things to consider. If you'd like to pick, you know, 2 or 3 of those impacts, and what might a smart target look like for your contract? Okay, I'll stop sharing there. Ava, I don't know whether that was completely clear in the translation. Are we happy to? You're nodding, so I assume we'll just go straight off into our groups. Let's have 20 minutes for that discussion and see what you can come up with by way of smart targets. Thank you. Okay, welcome back, everyone. Hopefully we've got everybody back. So, smart objectives. What did you make of objectives? Can we hear from the first group, please?
Tak já zase začnu, zase se vrátím k té naší modelové nebo zakázce, kterou jsme využili jako příklad pro výměnu oken na našem úřadě. Mezi takové cíle, které lze označit za smart, lze sledovat, měřit, tak se určitě vztahují k tomu nakládání s odpady a je to něco, k čemu my se snažíme motivovat ty dodavatele, aby nám to nabídli v rámci hodnocení. Aby nám třeba řekli, že řekněme 80% plastů ze stávajících oken bude využito k znovu výrobě nových oken. Něco podobného. Čili my jsme tyhle cíle konkrétně nestanovili, protože úplně přesně neznáme tu situaci na trhu, nevíme, jaké jsou možnosti, ale právě chceme dodavatele motivovat k tomu, aby oni nám vlastně řekli. Dalším takovým cílem ten může směřovat k využití druhotných surovin a v podstatě obdobně, čili řekneme, že třeba při výrobě nových oken bude třeba ze 30% využito recyklované sklo. Takže to jsou třeba kritéria v téhleté oblasti. Potom jsme se bavili ještě o kritériích v té oblasti zaměstnanosti a vzdělávání, kde se dá samozřejmě jasně stanovit, že třeba v průběhu realizace veřejné zakázky získají praxi třeba 3 studenti, každý v rozsahu 100 hodin a budou se podílet na nějakých konkrétních činnostech, konkrétně třeba vymezíme. Případně to vlastně u některých zakázek teď taky děláme, že přímo směřujeme na některé školy, se kterými to máme projednané, které kraj zřizuje, kde víme, že tam vlastně jsou oborově zaměřené, tak jako ten předmět zakázky, kde to opravdu dává velký smysl, aby ti studenti se toho účastnili. A obdobná kritéria potom zase lze využít ve vztahu k osobám znevýhodněným na trhu práce, čili dá se jasně stanovit, že tam tu práci získají osoby třeba z úřadu práce nebo podobně. A dá se říct nějaké konkrétní zase číslo, konkrétní údaj, který je potom jednoduše zase vysledovatelný, doložitelný a zhodnotitelný, že je plněný. Takže to je asi za nás, za první skupinu.
Já bych ještě trošičku zdržovala, můžu? V rámci té první skupiny, jak jste předtím povídali vlastně, že bylo by dobrý, smart, měřitelné kritérium člověkohodiny s lidmi s trvalým bydlištěm v daném okrese. Já si to prostě neumím představit. Jako umím si představit, že bych tam dala takový požadavek, ale nevím, jestli by to nebylo diskriminační, jestli by se mě ty firmy neozvaly, když se mě sem bude hlásit třeba firma, která opravdu nemá zaměstnance tady v tomhle okrese, protože v rámci republiky ty okresy jsou nalepený jeden na druhý a máme firmy třeba, které jsou o 20 kilometrů dál a už je to jiný okres a mají tam převážně lidi tam z té oblasti. Jestli bych tím nediskriminovala, jestli by mě to prošlo.
Já možná do toho vstoupím, dovolím si trochu odpovědět. My teď budeme vydávat publikaci, která se právě i těmhle otázkám věnuje a vlastně nedoporučujeme úplně to dávat jako podmínku do toho zadávacího řízení, protože máme obavy samozřejmě, že by to bylo viděno jako diskriminační. Nicméně my jsme i tady v té naší druhé skupině diskutovali to, že zadavatel si to může nechat v podstatě jenom monitorovat a nechat si vykázat, kolik zaměstnává místních a případně by se to mohlo vztahovat i na ten dodavatelský řetězec. To znamená, aby zhotovitel reportoval, kolik poddodavatelů je třeba z kraje. A potom samozřejmě, pokud se to bude to veliká stavba, tak v rámci PR a měření nějakého dopadu sociálního, environmentálního té veřejné zakázky lze říct třeba, že 20% z ceny zakázky bylo utraceno v místním dodavatelském řetězci a bylo zaměstnáno 1000 místních lidí. Jo, jako vlastně, že by to nebyl ten požadavek v rámci zakázky, ale jako v uvozovkách pouze jenom v rámci toho monitoringu.
Jo, tak to už si umím představit. Děkuju.
A já možná, Shaune, rovnou dám slovo té naší druhé skupině, která ale v podstatě debatovala nebo formulovala podobné smart cíle jako skupina okolo Jakuba Váni. A dámy, vyzývám vás, co vás napadá, co ještě dalšího bychom mohli tady k těm smart cílům, které zazněly, přidat.
Tak my jsme to diskutovali. Já bych třeba přidala určitě nějaký jako druh certifikace dřeva. My v Česku používáme PFC certifikaci, která využívá více jakoby české dřevo. Mluvila jsem i o využití kůrovcového dřeva, protože už máme několik let kalamitu a několik let ještě kalamitu mít budeme. V Česku taky funguje iniciativa Zero Landfill Commitment, kdy se vlastně firmy přihlašují k tomu, že jejich odpady nepůjdou na skládku, tak to si myslím, že je taky celkem zajímavý cíl. A myslím, že jsme se ještě bavili o technice, tam zmiňovala jedna kolegyně, že může být požadavek i na techniku, na využívanou techniku, aby se zastropovala třeba hlučnost a prašnost. Tak to asi jenom dodám ještě z té naší diskuze.
Brilliant, thank you. Yeah, I'm loving all this. So what we're talking about now is at what point are we setting targets? So yes, there was a discussion earlier. I mean, I like the fact the first group has now gone from refurbishment of a building to thinking about just replacement of windows. Well, what is it we do about windows? And that's great. If you don't know what good practice is and what a stretching target, smart target might be, then of course it's perfectly acceptable to take it to the next stage to evaluate the tenders. So for people that are an organization that's removing and replacing windows, you can ask them what target they will offer you in the tender for waste diversion from landfill, and they will tell you how they can do it. And then you can evaluate that as part of a balanced scorecard, which we'll talk about next. Equally, on the discriminatory question, either, if something might be seen as discriminatory under the EU procurement rules, there's lots of things that can and can't be done under the rules. Please do take legal advice for that. Don't listen to me. But as Ava suggested, you can simply ask for it to be measured. So you may not be specifying, for instance, the number of local employees. You simply say to the contractor at the beginning of the process, what I expect you to do is to measure the number of employees on this project that are local, and you might want to have a very clear definition of local, and simply collect the data and make that part of your contract management process. So you can go from putting something in the spec to say, you do this, it's in the spec, end of story, this is exactly the target that I want to achieve. Or you can say, I want to set a target around a specific issue, waste to landfill by way of example. Please tell me what target you will offer, and then I put some evaluation award points against those offers. Or finally, I simply say I want to collect some data on this issue. So as part of the contractual requirement, you will tell me what you have by way of employees, local business, etc. Very good point about FSC. A very good international standard for timber, and certainly one that, again, in the UK public sector, it's a requirement that FSC or PEFC timber is specified, and that's a really good thing. Although once again, you need to understand the market for FSC timber in your own region. In the UK and many other European countries, it's available. It doesn't really cost any more, and you can buy it. I'm not sure what the market conditions are in your country. You spoke about locally grown timber as well, and that's certainly something that we have in the UK. We have a scheme called Grown in Britain, where timber can be certified as having been grown locally from sustainable forests. So going a little bit away from FSC, which is a global standard, and looking at something that's a lot more local. So great, there's some really good discussions and really good choices in there. Okay, so can we move to the last group then, and we'll switch from Windows to computers.
Okay, we discussed several performance targets in general, but in relation to sustainable procurement, we discussed, let's say, just two. One of them relates to a percentage of recycled plastic. And I went to the webpage of TCO Certified and identified several computers to obtain knowledge of how much I can afford. And the percentage varied from 10% until 57.7. So we would probably be a little bit more demanding. So we would require at least 20% of recycled plastic. And In addition, we would include this percentage into evaluation. So we would assign, let's say, 5% weight to percentage of plastic. And the second performance target we discussed was related to energy consumption. Of course, we can set some maximum kilowatt per hour requirement, but we wouldn't do it because we think that the computers are pretty much the same inside. They have usually some Intel processor or AMD processor, probably the same memory, etc. So we do not see a big difference in energy consumption. So we wouldn't use that criteria. So in our computer tender, we would require just minimum percentage of plastic.
Excellent, thank you. That's really starting to focus on things that are important and material to the supply, and great that you actually did some research to find out what percentages were available and then set a target. And you know, your 20% suggestion is great because it's stretching to a degree. It's significantly above the minimum, but you're not stretching it so far that you're going to reduce competition. We're going to be talking about tender criteria next, but that's a really good way of doing things to include it as part of your tender criteria, and to allow a decent weighting factor. And again, there's kind of the weighting factors that you apply are very much a judgment call. But you need to make it enough so it can make a material difference when prices are close and everything else is close specification, etc. But not so much, again, that you end up then by buying possibly a product that's price uncompetitive because you've specified too highly. So yeah, that's a really good thinking. And again, we're starting to kind of narrow down to what's really important. We mentioned earlier, Energy Star for IT equipment. So that's, something that's perfectly an acceptable level playing field that you can create. But obviously, as you've seen from your own research already, the amount of recycled content into different computers is very different. Recycled plastics, very important factor. So that's fantastic. Thank you. Okay, so I'm gonna share again. Take you on to the next exercise. Ava, can I just confirm that we're scheduled to finish at 12:30 your time? Is that correct?
Yes,
yep. Okay.
Correct. Yeah.
That's great. Thank you. Okay, so moving on into the procurement process, which some of you have already started to go there. So this is the two graphics that you see in front of you are graphics from the standard as examples. I won't go through them in a great deal of detail, but it's really just looking at the stages of a tender process. So you might look at a pre-qualification stage where you're asking some questions about your supplier's track record, and you've maybe got some go no go criteria in there. So if you've got some very hardwired requirements, so say for instance, Energy Star for your IT equipment, you have to have that. If you haven't got it, then you don't get to tender. There may be some minimum requirements around payment, for instance. I think you mentioned payment as being a very important issue in your construction contracts. So there may be some criteria there. You both talked about ethics and human rights issues. One of the things, I'll pop up a link in the chat if you're not familiar with it, the Ethical Trading Initiative Base Code is a very good starting point for some basic human rights. It's quite a well-established international standard for human rights. And you might simply say, you know, I want you to confirm that you'll comply with this as a minimum, as a condition to tender. And then we get into the invitation to tender stage. This is where you're asking your suppliers to commit to some things. So it may be compliance with the requirement that you've set, or it may be, as you know, the example that we just had with the recycled plastics in IT, you may set a minimum, but you might ask for the supplier to respond to say, what level of recycled plastic can you offer? And you include that as part of your evaluation criteria. You might want to ask a supplier, for instance, to quote options. So a computer with a higher level of recycled plastic might be a more expensive computer, but you may choose to take that over a cheaper one that has less recycled plastic. So you can start to kind of think about what your tender criteria might look like there. And then, you know, thinking about the construction side of things, then, yeah, what percentage of waste diverted from landfill? I think in the group that we're talking about windows, we talked about reuse. So obviously reuse and recycling are different things. So once again, you might want to ask for a bit more detail. So you might want to ask what percentage is diverted from landfill, or one of the groups talked about a zero to landfill commitment. You might want to make that a requirement, but then to ask at a level of the next level of detail, what waste is being reused, recycled, or converted to energy, i.e. burnt in an energy waste to energy facility. So again, sort of thinking through what those tender criteria might look like. Or finally, as we spoke about some of the issues around local procurement and local employment, you may not want to ask the supplier to offer targets at all. You may simply ask them to measure their performance so they can give you some data, and you can maybe work that through your contract management, supplier relationship management processes. So lots of different ways to think about criteria. This is another example, again, from the London Olympics, the balance scorecard that they used. It was quite some time ago, but it's still being quoted as best practice. So we get the mission for the organization at the top to deliver venues, facilities, infrastructure and transport on time for the London 2012 Games that are fit for purpose and in a way that maximizes the delivery of a sustainable legacy within the available budget. So in one sentence there, they've covered a lot of stuff, but sustainability is a very clear element of that contract. And then if you look at the main headings there, there's something about cost, there's something about time, there's safe and secure. There's a big section on equalities and inclusion. So this is ethnic minorities, disabled people, disadvantaged communities generally, environment, quality and functionality, and then finally legacy, which is really, you know, after the Olympics, what happens to the venues, what happens to the equipment, etc. Typically 60% of the evaluation criteria would be non-cost criteria. So only 40%, and in some cases only 20% would be balanced on the cost. Again, this is there are no right or wrong answers to weighting criteria here. It really is very specific to the procurement that you're using. As I said earlier, there is now in the public sector in the UK a minimum 10% requirement, but we are seeing some purchasers in the UK and in Australia and elsewhere applying percentages up to 40%. on things like citizen services, where it's that's all to do with services related to vulnerable people, etc., is starting to be very, very significant percentage weighting criteria, and that makes a difference to markets. Those organizations that are supplying into the market have got to really think about the social value that they're offering, because it will make a difference between winning and losing a project. In a lot of cases, particularly for services, there's not that much difference between prices. So that the tender competition tends to be more about the non-price criteria. So what I'd like you to do next back in your groups, I suggest a little less time for this exercise because some of you have already started to think about criteria. So if I can maybe give you 15 minutes to go back into your group. So we've looked at specification, we've looked at smart targets. Now, what criteria will you apply, and how will you assess the tenders coming back? How will you know that your supply chain is actually complying with the criteria that you've asked for? So if we can do 15 minutes on that, please, and then we'll come back to the groups. Okay, welcome back, everybody. We're running a bit short of time, but we have one more exercise to complete. So if we can go briefly around the groups then to think about evaluation criteria. So if we can start with the first group.
Takže zase navážu na výměnu oken a v podstatě i na ty cíle, které jsem zmiňoval minule. Vlastně pokud jde o výběr dodavatele, čili nějaká ta hodnotící kritéria, tak jsme se trošku inspirovali metodou best value, kde jsme vlastně vymezili ty naše priority, ty naše cíle a dáváme prostor dodavatelům, aby je naplnili, aby vlastně se oni konkrétně třeba zavázali k nějakým konkrétním číslům nebo k tomu, co jsou schopni splnit. A snažili jsme se tohleto potom provázat do obchodních podmínek a vlastně do toho průběžného reportování v průběhu plnění zakázky, tak aby jsme byli schopni sledovat, jestli to, co nám nabídli, tak skutečně plní. A zároveň vlastně jsme připraveni to s nimi v průběhu zakázky řešit, pokud by se ukázalo, že prostě k naplnění těch cílů nesměřujeme. Využili jsme vlastně i zkušeností, tuším, že z Karlovy univerzity máme vlastně v týmu dodavatele přímo člověka, manažera odpovědného přístupu, který by měl být odpovědný za to reportování, plnění těch cílů a dosahování těch cílů. A mělo by se to dít vlastně průběžně, protože třeba u té naší zakázky máme dobu plnění zhruba 2 roky a chceme minimálně jednou za 3 měsíce ten report mít, tak aby jsme měli skutečně přehled, jestli směřujeme k naplnění těch kritérií, k dosažení těch cílů, na základě kterých jsme toho dodavatele vybrali. A samozřejmě v první fázi to s ním řešit jakoby aktivně, pozitivně, co se dá udělat pro to, aby se to zlepšilo, aby se to posunulo. A až ve chvíli, kdyby tohle nefungovalo nebo nevedlo to k cíli, tak potom samozřejmě nastoupí nějaké sankční mechanismy, nějaké pokuty, nedej bože i třeba odstoupení od smlouvy, ale to už samozřejmě je něco, co nikdo nechce.
Brilliant, thank you. You've done part of the last exercise as well, which is really useful. Moving on to absolutely the point about what do you ask the supplier to commit to. It goes into the contract, and then you ask them to report on their performance, which was the last piece I was going to do. So thank you for that. Okay, can we have the second group, please?
Já možná jenom krátce řeknu, že VUT v Brně právě používá pro zakázky, kde je to vhodné, tu hodnotu best value approach. Takže tam se domníváme, že ty aspekty buď inovační, anebo třeba sociálně odpovědné se uplatní. U služeb projektanta v minulém roce se ty aspekty inovace vyplatily. Teď má VUT v Brně vypsanou veřejnou zakázku na ostrahu a je to taky formou teda best value approach. Ten cíl té zakázky je formulovaný, není to možná tou terminologií, jako používá teď SOVZ, ale ten cíl zakázky je samozřejmě stabilní tým a ten směřuje teda k sociálně odpovědnému zadávání taky. Takže domníváme se, že na to jsme připraveni tady touto metodou, jinak v klasických řízeních jsme zatím nepoužili kritérium odpovědného zadávání v hodnocení.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I think that there's no reason why best value criteria can't include sustainability. So it's working through from those sustainability criteria that you're asking for to what you see in the tender processes and how you evaluate them coming back. So as in the previous example, asking a supplier to commit to a certain level of sustainability performance and then putting that commitment into the contract. Okay, yes, I've got a message from Ava to say, can we skip the last group because we only have 10 minutes left. Great minds think alike. I was planning to do that, so thank you. Okay, so let's move on to the last group, and then I'm going to talk about performance management before we close. So if we can get some quick feedback from the last group, please.
Okay, so quickly. So initially we thought that our homework is done because we would put into evaluation 90% value on price and 5% on recycled plastic.
Yep.
But then we continued to think about other criteria, and actually we found two which are worth considering. First of all, we might think about let's say quality or durability, or I can't say it correctly, but if we evaluate only cost, we will get the minimum or the product which meets our minimum criteria. But we might put, I don't know, 20% of value into, let's say, performance of the computer, which will lead to extending the product life. So we can evaluate performance of the processor based on some CPU benchmark criteria, or let's say capacity of the battery in case of notebooks. So also quality, I don't know whether to call it quality or somehow else, but it's also worth considering. And then we discussed about the ethics, ethical and labor and security and human rights question. And I can imagine to make it evaluation criteria as well. I may describe that I'm worried about human rights and labor rights and security, etc., and ask the supplier to describe the measures the producer takes to secure these rights within the whole supply chain. And of course, I can evaluate the depth into which the manufacturer goes, whether just into tier 1 or tier 2, tier 3, and also the how wide he goes, whether just human rights or does his code of conduct incorporate conflicting minerals, fraud, and many other aspects which are worth considering. So, but we didn't work it into details, but I can imagine that, and I would maybe ask you if you have ever noticed anything like that.
Yes, absolutely. It's quite common, particularly in the IT industry, that there's there's a collaboration around ethical standards for IT. I'll look it up and I'll send a link through to Ava because I can't quite remember the name of the organization, but certainly ethical standards in the IT industry. If you ask the big manufacturers what they do, you will get responses around those things. And you know, today's session really is just to set your minds thinking about some of these issues. So it's great that you've kind of looked at things like recycled plastic, the life of a piece of IT equipment. Absolutely, if you buy a piece of kit that lasts 3 years or a piece of kit that lasts 5 years, you've got a more sustainable and potentially more cost-effective solution for the more durable products. And yes, certainly, as I say, I will send a link through because when I come off this call, I'm sure I'll remember the name of the organization that collaborates around IT globally. So yeah, there are certainly those standards available. Okay, we're running very short of time. So as I suggested, I think most of you have got the hang of, you've been talking about performance measurement and criteria anyway. So I'm just going to talk about contract management rather than run the exercise on it so we don't overrun. So the next stage then, having secured commitments from your supply chain, is to collect some data and to get yourselves set up to receive data. One of the groups suggested a quarterly report. I've seen reports monthly on some projects, so you can actually really understand what's going on a project and do something about the performance. And that will be whatever it is, whatever criteria it is you've set through the course of the contract. So this could be, you know, we've talked about waste diverted from landfill. We've talked about in construction, maybe emissions related to transport and logistics. We've talked about measuring local employment, local procurement, etc. We've talked about the recycled plastic idea in IT equipment. Well, understanding, are you really getting the levels of recycled plastic that you expect? Penalties and incentivization was mentioned as well. So if you can measure the performance of a supplier, then obviously you can incentivize good performance and penalize poor performance if necessary. And there can be a hierarchy of reporting as shown in this diagram. So you might have, you know, a number of construction projects under your wing, and you might want to look at overall, how am I doing in, say, waste to landfill, and then each individual project, how's that individual project doing? So, or indeed even then down to work packages within a project. So your sustainability reporting would follow the sort of supply chain hierarchy that you have. So I won't run this exercise, as I say, in the interest of time, but it's a logical follow-on from everything that we've discussed so far. So you get down to the criteria in the contract, then we need to have a way of measuring the performance. So a quick summary, and then I'll open up to any final questions before we close. So we've talked about sustainability in the round, about environmental, social, economic impacts. We've talked about the golden thread from your organizational objectives and aims through to prioritizing through your supply chain, and you've done that in today's exercise. And then we've gone through this afternoon a procurement cycle to understand how you would actually include these sustainability criteria in each and every stage of the procurement cycle. So I hope you found that useful. Sorry we had to rush a little bit at the end, but I think there was some really valuable discussions there in the groups. I'll open up to any final questions or comments that you might have, and then hand back to Ava to close the session. Okay. Okay, if there are no final questions, then Ava, I'll hand back to you.
Děkuju moc. Já možná pár komentářů k vlastně využití ISA. Na začátku zaznělo, že podle tohoto ISA se nedá certifikovat, ale je to v podstatě takový průvodce toho celého procesu a na něm je vlastně krásně vidět, že celé odpovědné zadávání a nakupování neleží rozhodně jenom na vás zakázkářích a nákupním oddělení, ale prolíná se opravdu celou organizací, ba co víc, jde to mimo organizaci, ať už k dodavatelům nebo lidem, kteří vlastně pak produkty té zakázky využívají, takže není to vůbec nějaký uzavřený, ohraničený prostor, ale je to velký svět, se kterými je potřeba pracovat. Pro nás určitě vnímáme, že v České republice je opravdu challenge, výzva zahrnout i to vysoké vedení organizací, získat si jejich přízeň, respektive drive. Určitě je pro nás výzvou to měření, které my se snažíme teď i v našem projektu trošičku se do toho pustit. I v rámci MPSV jsme moc rádi, že můžeme i spolupracovat s vámi jako Jakub Váňa z Jihomoravského kraje, který v podstatě nás už možná trošku i přeskočil v tom měření. A budeme moc rádi, když se i vy ostatní do toho úsilí zapojíte. A krásně se to váže na tu poslední kapitolu, kterou sice jsme neměli moc času tady projít, ale to je ten contract management a vůbec si to hlídání, jak se všechny ty požadavky naplňují a nejenom možná ty sociální a environmentální a vůbec plnění těch smluv a s jakými výsledky ti dodavatelé nakonec skončí to plnění pro naše organizace. Pokud není ještě nějaká myšlenka, nějaký dojem, který byste chtěli sdílet a někdo se přihlásit o slovo, tak já bych ještě, než skončíme, vás pozvala na další semináře, které připravujeme v rámci Institutu odpovědného veřejného zadávání, nebo se můžete vlastně podívat už na ty záznamy minulé, kde vlastně v téhle době nás to přimělo všechno natočit, takže i zpětně se můžete podívat v jakémkoliv čase, kdy budete chtít. A možná někteří z vás ještě nejsou členy naší platformy odpovědného veřejného zadávání, tak opět je to výzva, je to fajn skupina, podobná účastníkům, řada z vás už v té platformě je a je to super příležitost právě pracovně diskutovat všechny otázky, které vás napadaly, určitě jste diskutovali i v rámci těch skupinek a můžeme v tom dál pokračovat. Teď už mi nezbývá, než velmi vřele poděkovat, Shaune, vám za výbornou prezentaci, za přínosný pohled na odpovědné zadávání. Já věřím, že i vám se dnešní a minulá debata líbila. Já musím říct, že jsem docela pyšná na naše zadavatele, protože za ty roky je opravdu vidět, jaký kus cesty udělali. Řada z nich už zmiňovala, jakou mají zkušenost a praxi v odpovědném zadávání, což před pár lety byl jako jenom náš sen. Takže opravdu ten posun je vidět a věřím, že i díky vaší prezentaci a díky ISU zase se posuneme dál a budeme mít možnost to sdílet i s ostatními zadavateli. Takže ještě jednou moc děkuju a loučím se s vámi se všemi.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good day.